Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the lives of medieval royals who, by day, commanded kingdoms, and by night, perhaps drifted through altered states of reality. So, before you settle in too comfortably, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see the global community joining in. Now, let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and ease our way into tonight's historical journey. When you hear the name Queen Isabella of Castile, you likely picture a formidable, unstoppable force of political will. The woman who unified Spain, backed a bewildered Italian sailor who thought he'd landed in Asia, and essentially glared at Europe until it behaved. But beneath that iron rule and fierce religious conviction, Isabella also managed another kind of kingdom, her personal pharmacy. This collection would likely send any 21st century wellness influencer into total shock. Being a queen was undoubtedly stressful. There were crusades to oversee, nobles to keep in line, treaties to sign, and a daily onslaught of at least 5 attempts to overthrow you before lunch. So, Isabella turned to what any overwhelmed ruler in the 15th century might: her herbal cabinet. This wasn't just any cabinet. It was stocked with medieval remedies that worked surprisingly well, and probably violated the narcotic laws of about 17 modern countries. Take insomnia, for example. Today, you might sip chamomile tea. Isabella? She was served opium tea. Not a gentle bedtime blend, mind you, but a sleep-inducing draft so potent it could knock a seasoned warrior into a coma. Feeling stressed before a big diplomatic meeting? Isabella's doctors reached for cannabis-infused concoctions, because apparently international relations were best navigated with shoulders thoroughly melted into the throne. Foreign ambassadors who visited Basil's court frequently noted the ethereal atmosphere. A polite way of saying the throne room resembled a perfumed fog machine set to maximum. Some envoys left meetings so relaxed they forgot to deliver half their diplomatic messages. One Venetian diplomat wrote that audiences with Basil felt like meeting a god in a cloud of perfume. Translation: the fumes hit him harder than expected. Did Basil intentionally seek out these effects? Hard to say. Blue lotus was culturally embedded in Byzantine ritual, especially among the elite. In bathhouses, the heated air infused with lotus oil created a dreamy haze, perfect for discussing politics, philosophy, or which general needed to be fired next. But Basil definitely enjoyed the aesthetic. He commissioned perfumes, reordered ceremonial incense blends, and reportedly preferred lotus-scented halls over normal air. Because why breathe boring oxygen when you can breathe something with personality? And the best part? Basil governed surprisingly well. He reorganized finances, strengthened the army, and founded a dynasty, all while living inside a fragrant, mildly psychoactive botanical cloud. So yes, Basil I wasn't just the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. He was Byzantium's most elegantly relaxed emperor. King Richard the Lionheart is remembered as a crusading hero, a military genius, a man whose preferred communication style was loud sword noises, and someone who spent approximately 3 days of his entire reign actually in England. What people forget is that Richard's life was a non-stop conveyor belt of injuries, and medieval medicine handled those injuries with the delicacy of a brick through a window. Richard fought constantly. Siege warfare, skirmishes, justs, battles, tournaments. If violence were a loyalty program, Richard would have reached platinum status in a week. When Arminius finally returned to Germania, he did not come as a wandering exile, but as a decorated Roman officer, the kind of man governors welcomed with open arms, expecting loyalty and obedience. Yet, the moment his boots touched the forest soil of his homeland, he felt the divide between Rome's polished marble and the raw earth of the tribes. Germania was not a land that bowed easily. The rivers flowed as they always had. The oak groves whispered as they always had, but beneath the familiar landscape, there was tension, sharp enough to taste. Rome had promised alliance. What the tribes received was occupation. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor, saw his position not as stewardship but as domination. He imposed taxes, an alien concept to tribes who believed wealth was measured in honor, not coin. And he enforced Roman law with an arrogance that outpaced his understanding of local customs. Courts, punishments, and demands for tribute spread like a rash, irritating every chieftain from the Weser to the Rhine. Rome might have believed it was bringing order, but to the Germans it felt like a slow suffocation. Arminius saw it immediately. The chiefs who greeted him did so with pride, but also with quiet desperation. These were men who had once stood tall beside his father, yet now they whispered their complaints in shadows, fearful of Roman spies. They asked Arminius what he had seen in the capital. Was Rome truly unstoppable? Was resistance hopeless? His answers were careful, measured, never revealing the fire already building inside him. Varus, blind and complacent, admired Arminius. Here was a German who spoke perfect Latin, who had fought Rome's battles, who understood Roman discipline. In Varus's mind, Arminius was an asset, a bridge between cultures, someone who could help pacify the region. Convoys of prisoners, conscripted peasants, and regular soldiers stretched across the roads of Chine, thousands walking in rigid formation as stern-faced overseers barked orders. They carried little more than basic tools: wicker baskets for hauling earth, crude chisels for shaping rock, and roughly hewn wooden poles for rudimentary scaffolding. Once they reached the frontier, they found no welcoming inns, no warm shelters, and no tidy barracks awaiting them. Instead, they were confronted by jagged mountainsides, barren deserts, and an expanse of wind so fierce it seemed determined to strip the flesh from their bones. Work began long before dawn and continued until the stars reappeared in the night sky. Overseers enforced discipline with brutal whips and heavy rods. Food was meager, often nothing more than thin millet gruel, while drinking water had to be hauled from distant streams or painstakingly melted from snow. Laborers who collapsed from exhaustion were given only fleeting moments to recover before being forced back to work. The emperor demanded speed, and speed demanded sacrifices. And yet, amidst the pervasive cruelty and suffering, a strange sense of unity began to emerge. Soldiers who had once served rival kingdoms now hauled stones side by side. Hardened criminals labored next to peasants who had never broken a law in their lives. Under Qin rule, everyone was equal in one respect: no one was allowed to stop working. As the first foundations of the wall began to take shape, the laborers gradually realized something that chilled them far more than the relentless northern winds. This was not a temporary project. This was their life now. For months, years, or however long their bodies could endure, the wall would continue to rise, and its builders would slowly disappear into it. The northern frontier bore little resemblance to the fertile heartland the laborers had left behind. To understand the true power of the ancient Olympics, one must first understand Greece in the 8th century BCE, a land of fierce independence, proud rivalries, and constant conflict. City-states like Sparta, Athens, Argos, and Corinth were more than neighbors. They were competitors in politics, trade, and war. Feuds could last generations, borders shifted with every season, and distrust was the default. And yet, every 4 years, something extraordinary happened. A divine peace known as the Ekakyria, or Sacred Truce, was proclaimed across the Greek world. Heralds traveled from Olympia to the farthest city-states announcing that during the upcoming games all warfare must cease. Soldiers were ordered to put down their spears, generals postponed campaigns, and even bitter enemies agreed, if only temporarily, to honor the will of Zeus. This truce was not a polite suggestion but a sacred obligation. Violating it meant offending the king of the gods himself, an act considered reckless at best and suicidal at worst. The Greeks believed that the gods watched over the games with sharp, discerning eyes, ready to punish those who disrespected their festival. The practical effects were astonishing. Roads that were usually dangerous suddenly became safe. Pilgrims could walk hundreds of miles across mountains, past hostile territories, and through strange cities without fear. Athletes, trainers, poets, merchants, and spectators made their way to Olympia in long caravans, united by a purpose greater than politics. For many Greeks, the journey itself was a spiritual transformation. A Spartan might travel beside an Athenian without reaching for a weapon. A Corinthian merchant might share a wineskin with a Theban storyteller by the roadside. Encounters that never would have occurred in wartime. And in Greece, wartime was most of the time. The sacred truce also signaled the start of ritual preparations in each city. But the real star of her medical arsenal was mandrake root. Medieval folks believed that mandrake screamed when pulled from the earth, an excellent sign. Naturally, it was thought to cure just about anything, less excellent perhaps, and could sedate even the most anxious monarch. Isabella consumed mandrake preparations the way modern people drink lattes. Regularly, confidently, and with only a mild fear of hallucinating an angel lurking in the corner. And then there was henbane. Supposedly, henbane was used to relax the mind. In reality, it relaxed you so profoundly that your mind briefly packed its bags and went on vacation. Yet physicians insisted it sharpened judgment. Sure, nothing hones political decision-making quite like a mild, medieval, out-of-body experience. There's something wonderfully human about picturing Isabella, the queen who reshaped the world map, sitting in her chambers after a long day, cradling her cup of medicinal opium, and thinking, perhaps I can run an empire and ascend to heaven simultaneously. And the best part? It was all considered perfectly normal. No one whispered, Your Majesty, perhaps this is a bit strong. No, they said, this will balance your humors, which was medieval medical slang for, we have absolutely no idea what we're doing, but this stuff knocks people out beautifully. So yes, Isabella conquered kingdoms, launched voyages, and reshaped continents, all while occasionally hovering several inches above her throne, thanks to the strongest herbal cocktails medieval science could legally concoct. If medieval Europe ever held a most likely to drink something he shouldn't competition, King Charles the Bad of Navarre would win by a mile, probably accepting the trophy while high on something brewed by his court alchemists. Charles didn't earn the moniker the Bad for being evil per se. He got it because his decisions ranged from dangerously impulsive to, Sir, please step away from the potion. Naturally, he accumulated wounds like a medieval hobby. Arrows, swords, lances, friendly fire, unfriendly fire, you name it, he got hit by it. And because medieval medicine had not yet discovered anesthesia stronger than bite this stick, Richard's doctors relied heavily on opium-based treatments. And when I say based, I mean almost entirely opium. After battles, Richard's medical tent resembled a medieval spa run by someone who had heard about modern pharmacology only through vague rumors. Physicians prepared syrups, poultices, salves, and drinks with so much opium that Richard probably achieved spiritual enlightenment several times without meaning to. Imagine the scene. Richard lies on a table, bleeding, annoyed, and refusing to stop giving tactical orders. A physician approaches with a cup. Drink this, sire. It will ease the pain. Richard asks, does it also make me invincible? The physician replies, probably not, but you won't care anymore. Even during long sieges, Richard's pain treatments included poppy wine, essentially medieval NyQuil with delusions of grandeur. Soldiers reported that after taking his medicine, the king would sit upright, calm, composed, and vaguely glowing, offering brilliant military strategies or occasionally reciting poetry at the wall. His most infamous injury came in 1199 when he was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. Medieval surgery ensued, which involved heated metal instruments, prayers, screaming, and, blessedly, opiate sedation. Richard reportedly remained shockingly calm throughout the procedure, proof that either he was superhuman or the opium dose was strong enough to tranquilize a cavalry horse. And yet, throughout all this, Richard's leadership remained sharp. He negotiated truces mid-siege, led armies with terrifying charisma, and terrified enemies, even while bandaged like a medieval scarecrow. He had no idea that Arminius was studying him, not with loyalty, but with calculation, because Arminius knew what the Germans could not yet admit. Rome did not negotiate. Rome absorbed. Today it was taxes and courts. Tomorrow it would be disarmament, labor conscription, and hostages taken generation after generation. His people were on borrowed time. Germania needed a leader, not a diplomat, not a negotiator, but a strategist. Someone who understood Rome from the inside. And Arminius realized, with a clarity that reshaped the course of history, that he was the only man who could fill that role. Rome had returned him to his homeland. They had no idea he came carrying their doom. Arminius understood that revolutions don't start with shouting. They start with listening quietly, patiently, until every complaint, every insult, every wound inflicted by the occupying force reveals a pattern. So, he traveled from tribe to tribe, attending councils, drinking at feasts, and sitting beside chieftains who had grown bitter under Roman rule. Some had sons conscripted into auxiliary forces. Others had lost land to Roman administrators. A few simply hated the idea of answering to men who wore skirts made of metal plates. But all shared one truth. The tribes of Germania had never been more united in their anger. The problem was fear. Rome looked invincible. 3 legions guarded the region. Disciplined, armored, and led by Varus, a governor who may have been incompetent, but still commanded overwhelming military force. The tribes had fallen before Rome before. Why should this time be different? Arminius had the answer. Because, unlike any Germanic leader before him, he knew Rome's weaknesses. He knew how legions marched, how they reacted under pressure, how supply lines could be disrupted, how commanders trusted maps more than instincts, and, most importantly, he knew how overconfidence could blind even the most seasoned Roman officer. There were no familiar terraced rice paddies, no gently flowing rivers winding through verdant valleys. The Great Wall was to be built where nature itself seemed to actively resist human presence. In the west, the land dissolved into the arid expanse of the Gobi Desert, where towering dunes shifted like living beasts and swallowed roads overnight. Farther east rose the formidable Ain Mountains, jagged ranges that tore at the sky and forced men to cling to sheer rock faces like insects. Everywhere else lay unforgiving plains patrolled by Xiongnu scouts, who observed the wall's construction from a distance with cold, predatory curiosity. For the laborers, the frontier felt like permanent exile. Winters arrived early, smothering the landscape in snow that never fully thawed. Gale-force winds screamed across the plains, bringing sand that scoured exposed skin raw and ice that cracked wooden scaffolding with terrifying ease. On some days, men worked wrapped in layers of woven grass simply to prevent their skin from freezing solid. On other days, they labored shirtless under the scorching summer heat, their sweat evaporating faster than it formed. Adequate shelter was a luxury they rarely enjoyed. Camps were typically little more than flimsy fabric tents weighed down with stones or hastily carved caves in the sides of cliffs. Fires were small and precious, fueled by the few sparse shrubs or branches the unforgiving land grudgingly offered. At night, the mournful howl of wolves blended seamlessly with the groans of exhausted men, creating a haunting chorus of suffering that echoed across the desolate valleys. Those who died during the grueling march north were simply left beside the roadside, unmourned and unburied. Those who died during construction were often buried beneath the nearest mound of earth, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without even pausing the day's backbreaking work. Yet the dangers weren't limited to the elements. Families chose which athlete would represent them. Noble houses boasted of sons training for glory, and gyms and running tracks filled with hopeful competitors. Even the poorest villagers dreamed of seeing Olympia, perhaps for the first and only time in their lives. As the days passed, excitement spread, and when the heralds' voices echoed across the hills, announcing the exact date of the games, Greece shifted into a rare moment of unity. The truce did not erase rivalries, but it elevated something more important. The shared belief that honoring Zeus and celebrating excellence was worth pausing the endless churn of war. In those sacred weeks, Greece remembered what it meant to be one people, and all roads, peaceful at last, led to Olympia. As the sacred truce took effect, the Greek world seemed to inhale deeply and, just for a moment, stop bracing for war. Roads that had once belonged to armies now filled with pilgrims carrying offerings, travelers seeking spectacle, and athletes chasing immortality. For many, the journey to Olympia was as important as the games themselves, a pilgrimage of devotion, endurance, and anticipation. Athletes often traveled months in advance, accompanied by trainers, family members, and supporters. Some came from wealthy city-states and arrived with well-funded entourages, while others came barefoot from remote villages, carrying little more than a bronze strigil and a bag of figs. Yet all walked the same dusty paths, all cooked over the same roadside fires, and all gazed toward the west with the same mixture of nerves and excitement. Along the way, small towns and sanctuaries offered places to rest, pray, and prepare. Inns overflowed, merchants set up stalls selling oil, salted fish, pottery, and amulets said to bring Zeus's favor, and poets and musicians performed for coins, turning the journey into a moving festival. His political schemes were chaotic, his alliances unpredictable, and his personal wellness routine was a medieval chemistry experiment gone either horribly or hilariously wrong. Where other kings relied on faith, discipline, or competent advisors, Charles trusted alchemy, the medieval version of science, but with significantly more personality quirks. His personal alchemist specialized in potions that promised everything: heightened intellect, improved mood, spiritual clarity, political courage, and, on one memorable occasion, immortality. These mixtures contained delightful ingredients like opium, hashish, hallucinogenic plants, exotic resins that had traveled farther than most peasants ever would, and powders that no one should be inhaling unless they had a death wish or a crown. Charles didn't just sip these potions cautiously. No, he consumed them with the enthusiasm of a college student discovering energy drinks for the first time. The results were impressive and occasionally catastrophic. One potion reportedly made him so euphoric he tried to negotiate peace with a tapestry. Another gave him visions he insisted were divine messages. His advisors nodded politely, scribbled down his ramblings, and tried not to panic when the king began describing conversations with imaginary diplomats. His court physicians, bless their optimistic hearts, insisted that these herbal concoctions would balance the humors. Instead, they unbalanced everything: his emotions, his sleep, his decision-making, and arguably his entire kingdom. And yet, Charles kept drinking them because to him, these brews weren't recreational. They were strategic tools. If a potion made him fearless, he'd wage war. If a potion made him paranoid, he'd accuse neighboring rulers of plotting against him. If a potion made him glow with cosmic self-confidence, he'd declare sweeping reforms that no one understood. Eventually, even foreign ambassadors learned the signs. In truth, Richard didn't use these substances recreationally. He used them because medieval warfare was basically a full-time attempt to destroy your skeleton. But thanks to medieval medicine's strongest herbal offerings, the Lionheart marched, fought, ruled, and occasionally floated. Queen Joanna of Castile, better known by the unfortunate nickname Joanna the Mad, has long been portrayed as emotionally unstable, dramatic, hysterical, or simply too much for the men who wrote her biographies. But the truth is far less insulting and far more medieval. Her court physicians kept giving her medicinal cocktails so potent they could tranquilize a choir. Joanna lived under enormous political pressure. Her husband betrayed her, her father manipulated her, her son imprisoned her, and half of Europe whispered behind her back like a medieval reality TV cast. So naturally, her doctors decided the solution to her stress was to make her relaxed, which in medieval medical language meant chemically launching her into orbit. Here's the rewritten segment in American English, following the interpret and clarify style with moderate creativity. Joanna's treatments included opium syrups for emotional distress, euphemistically known as "Good Night, Your Majesty." Cannabis oils were applied as soothing balms or placed under her tongue to quell her racing thoughts. There were also henbane teas, which induced a sense of calm and the somewhat philosophical observation that the floor had surprisingly interesting textures. And then came nightshade microdoses, the medieval equivalent of cautiously asking, "What if we accidentally poison the queen, but in a therapeutically beneficial way?" The worst part, Joanna rarely had any say in these treatments. If she wept, they administered a sedative. If she argued, another draft was thrust into her hands. If she attempted to articulate complex political ideas, some court physician would nod condescendingly and say, "Yes, yes, just drink this." He began to whisper the unthinkable. Rome could be defeated, not in open battle, that would be suicide, but in the forests where the trees closed in and cavalry became useless, in the mud where heavy armor turned soldiers into stumbling statues, in narrow passes where legions could not deploy into their perfect formations. Germania was not just home. It was a weapon, but a rebellion required unity, and unity required trust. So Arminius met secretly with leaders like Sigimerus, his father, Merobauduus of the Marcomanni, and chiefs from the Bructeri and the Chatti. They formed the skeleton of a coalition that Varus never suspected existed. At councils lit by firelight, warriors leaned forward as Arminius outlined a plan bold enough to feel like madness. Lure Varus deep into unfamiliar territory during a staged uprising, then destroy the Roman army piece by piece. Some chiefs hesitated. Betraying Rome was one thing. Executing a coordinated attack on 3 legions was another. But Arminius's confidence was contagious. His knowledge was precise, and his conviction was unmistakable. And slowly, resistance transformed into something tangible. Arminius was patient. By summer's end, the trap was meticulously set. All that remained was to lure Varus in a task Arminius knew would be almost laughably easy. After all, nothing is easier than deceiving a man convinced of his own infallibility. Arminius had spent enough time in the orbit of Roman governors to recognize a universal truth. The more inept the official, the more unshakable their belief in their own brilliance. Publius Quintilius Varus was the embodiment of this principle. Augustus had dispatched him to govern Germania as if he were simply transferring a desk-bound accountant to a branch office. Varus anticipated paperwork, not pitched battles. He genuinely believed the Germans simply needed a firm Roman hand, his own preferably, to civilize them. The Xiongnu lurked like shadows on horseback, constantly monitoring the progress of their enemy's new barrier. They launched sudden raids on vulnerable supply convoys, cut down stragglers who strayed too far from the main group, and occasionally circled the work sites just close enough to taunt the workers with intimidating shouts and volleys of arrows. Work would halt only long enough for Qin soldiers to chase the raiders away, and then the brutal overseers would relentlessly force the exhausted laborers back into their assigned positions. But the very harshness of the frontier served the emperor's calculated purpose. Here, no one could easily escape. Here, men disappeared without a trace, their names quickly fading into the howling wind. And here, in this crucible of ice, sand, and stone, the first true segments of the Qin wall began to rise, a monument to raw power, built in a place where human endurance was stretched to its absolute breaking point. The Qin Empire did not possess modern construction cranes, sophisticated iron machinery, or precise mathematical surveying tools for large-scale projects. What it had instead were human bodies, thousands upon thousands of them, and a ruler whose will was utterly unyielding. The specific methods employed to build the wall varied depending on the available terrain and local resources, but all shared one brutal truth. Every single meter required an immense amount of backbreaking labor. In the vast deserts and sweeping plains, the builders primarily used a technique known as rammed earth, a process that involved layering soil, gravel, and clay between temporary wooden frames. Teams of men then beat the mixture with heavy wooden rammers, the rhythmic thudding of the tools echoing across the stark landscape like the relentless heartbeat of some immense, earthbound beast. Storytellers, too, gathered crowds, recounting the victories of legendary athletes. Men who had lifted bulls, outrun horses, or been crowned 3, 4, even 5 times. But the pilgrimage wasn't only festive. It was a test. Athletes were expected to obey strict moral and physical discipline on the road. They trained in the mornings, abstained from excessive food or wine, and slept on hard surfaces to condition their bodies. They avoided impurity, prayed daily, and treated the journey not as a vacation but as the beginning of the competition. The closer they came to Olympia, the more reverent the atmosphere became. Travelers crossed rivers believed to be sacred, passed shrines to Hermes and Apollo, and walked beneath towering oak trees said to whisper oracles. The landscape itself seemed to prepare them for what awaited. Finally, after long days of marching, the travelers reached the Altis, the sacred grove that housed temples, treasuries, altars, and statues. The scent of burning incense drifted through the air, priests tended sacred fires, and above all stood the monumental temple of Zeus, its pediments gleaming in the sun. its presence overwhelming even the bravest athlete. For many pilgrims, stepping into Olympia felt like stepping out of the mortal world entirely. A place where gods watched from every shadow, where the greatest feats of human ability were expected, not exceptional, and where legends were born. Long before a single runner set foot on the track or a wrestler squared his stance, the ancient Olympics began with rituals, solemn, magnificent, and deeply rooted in the Greek relationship with the divine. For the Greeks, athletic competition was meaningless unless it honored the gods, and Zeus, king of Olympus, demanded nothing less than perfection. The day before the games officially opened, the Altus transformed into a vast ceremonial theater. If Charles greeted them calmly, he hadn't visited the alchemy lab yet. If he greeted them while sweating, trembling, or quoting prophecy, they knew negotiations were about to get very, very unpredictable. So yes, Charles the Bad wasn't just a king. He was medieval Europe's most committed potion tester. And in a world without warning labels, he explored the limits of alchemical medicine with heroic, or perhaps reckless, enthusiasm. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, crusader, philosopher, falcon enthusiast, multilingual genius, basically the medieval equivalent of a walking Wikipedia page, also had a lesser-known hobby. Sampling any herbal or chemical substance his scholars claimed would expand the intellect, which, in medieval science, meant pretty much anything. Frederick surrounded himself with scholars from across Europe and the Islamic world, men who studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and, most importantly, experimental narcotics. These physicians carried jars full of powders, tinctures, scented oils, resins, and dried plants that looked suspiciously like the ingredients list for an ancient rave. But Frederick was curious, dangerously so. Where other kings asked, "Is this safe?" Frederick asked, "What will happen if I take two?" His scholarly advisors, who really should have known better, encouraged this curiosity. In their defense, they sincerely believed these mixtures opened the mind to higher understanding. In practice, they opened the mind to conversations with falcons, hallucinations of angels wearing questionable fashion choices, and entire nights spent debating philosophy with people who had definitely left the room. Frederick's favorite substances were aromatic resins and herbal vapors used by Arab physicians during surgery and meditation. These fumes induced calm, clarity, and, if inhaled long enough, the sensation that the imperial ceiling had started breathing. And Joanna, intelligent, eloquent, and utterly exhausted, typically complied. Later, chroniclers would label her unstable. But let's be real. If you spent decades being force-fed medieval anti-anxiety medication, isolated from your children, and surrounded by opportunistic politicians, you wouldn't exactly be skipping around like a serene Disney princess, either. Picture her typical day. Joanna sits by her window, frustrated by her circumstances. A physician hurries over, bearing yet another potion. "Your Majesty, this will calm your nerves." Joanna replies wearily, "My nerves are fine. I need constitutional authority." The physician simply responds, "Yes, yes, drink the potion." Within minutes, Joanna is calmer. Not happier, not healthier, but decidedly calmer, because the concoction she just ingested is roughly akin to being gently tackled by a very polite elephant. The tragedy is that the more sedated she became, the more the men around her declared her unfit to govern. Joanna wasn't mad. She was medicated into oblivion by a court that profited from her silence. So yes, a significant portion of her life was lived in a gentle, medicinal haze not by choice, but because the political system found it more convenient. King Henry IV of England had a significant problem. He couldn't sleep, and not just the garden variety. I stayed up too late doom-scrolling insomnia, but the medieval, kingdom-crushing kind. The type where a king stares at the ceiling for 8 hours, obsessing over rebellions, unpaid soldiers, and whether God was personally displeased with him. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, Henry's doctors were determined to help. Medieval physicians believed that when the mind refused to rest, one had to blast it into submission using substances so potent they could knock out a cathedral. And because arrogance is rarely a solitary vice, he also believed Arminius was his devoted ally. This was the precise weakness Arminius intended to exploit. He began feeding Verus a carefully curated diet of falsehoods. A minor rebellion in a distant region, restless tribes, simmering discontent with Roman rule. Nothing too overt, just subtle enough to prick at Verus's inflated ego. Verus had spent months imposing Roman law on a people who vehemently rejected it. The mere suggestion of resistance was intolerable. Arminius played him with the delicate touch of a harpist, plucking each string until Verus himself became convinced that the situation demanded his personal intervention. The brilliance of the deception lay in its subtlety. Arminius never pushed too hard, never raised his voice. He simply voiced concerns, offered to guide the legions, and reassured Verus that everything was under control. In doing so, he reinforced the governor's cherished narrative that Rome had successfully Romanized a German prince who was eager to prove his loyalty. Verus swallowed it whole. As summer began to fade, Arminius suggested that the legions march into the Teutoburg forest region to quell the fabricated uprising. Verus, brimming with confidence in his authority and even more in Arminius, agreed without a moment's hesitation. He assembled 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with auxiliaries, camp followers, merchants, and a cumbersome train of wagons. It was not a swift strike force. It was a lumbering parade of men who saw the forests as mere scenic backdrop. However, a few Roman officers weren't so easily fooled. Suggests, a Germanic noble who harbored a deep distrust of Arminius, warned Verus in stark terms, "Do not trust this man. He plots against you." But Verus dismissed the warning out of hand. Why? Because Verus placed his faith in paperwork, ranks, and Roman titles, and Arminius possessed them all. This labor-intensive method produced walls that were dense enough to withstand the harsh weather conditions and tall enough to intimidate potential raiders. But the work was utterly punishing. Shoulders dislocated, palms blistered and tore open, and men collapsed in the dust from sheer exhaustion and dehydration. In the rugged mountains, the task became even more brutally challenging. Workers precariously carved narrow paths into sheer cliffsides, hauling immense stones up steep slopes that seemed determined to throw them back down with every step. Ropes frequently snapped under the strain. Makeshift scaffolding collapsed without warning. Massive slabs of granite slid like sudden avalanches, crushing those unfortunate enough to be standing in their path. To the cold-hearted overseers, these deaths were simply factored in as part of the overall cost of the project. Replace them, they would curtly order, waving forward the next line of trembling laborers. Ox-drawn carts carried materials across the most treacherous terrain, but often the paths became too narrow, too steep, or too muddy for even the strongest animals to navigate. When the animals could go no farther, men replaced them, pulling, pushing, and dragging the heavy loads with ropes that dug mercilessly into their shoulders until their skin tore and bled. Every sound that filled the air was a cacophonous blend of grunts of exertion, shouted orders, the cracking of whips, and the relentless pounding of the heavy rammers. Despite the staggering suffering and constant threat of death, the wall grew steadily longer, relentlessly consuming the landscape. Watchtowers rose above the plains and mountains, providing elevated vantage points from which soldiers could scan the horizon for the telltale dust trails of approaching Xiongnu riders. Trenches were dug to impede attackers. Crude barracks were constructed to house the soldiers. Thousands gathered around the great altar of Zeus, a towering mound of ash built from centuries of burnt offerings. Priests robed in white moved with measured steps, their voices rising in hymns older than any recorded Olympiad. The air thickened with the scent of olive branches, incense, and freshly slaughtered animals, whose smoke rose in spirals toward the sky. Athletes took part in a sacred oath ceremony at the Bouleuterion, the council hall. Standing before the statue of Zeus Horkios, Zeus of Oaths, they swore to obey the rules of the games, to compete honorably, and to train rigorously for the required 10 months. Breaking the oath invited not only punishment from officials but divine wrath. In front of Zeus's steely gaze, no man dared lie. Parents and spectators also offered sacrifices. Small bronze figurines, coins, olive wreaths, and textiles. Tokens of gratitude or desperate prayers. A A father might sacrifice a goat, hoping his son would return victorious, or a pilgrim might bring a simple offering of barley cake, asking only for safe travel home. The value of the gift mattered less than the sincerity behind it. The most dramatic ritual came with the Hekatombeon, a public sacrifice of 100 cattle to Zeus. As each animal fell, its blood soaked into the sacred earth, symbolizing purification and awe. The choicest meat was burned for the god, and the rest would later feed thousands in a massive communal feast. In this shared meal, rivalry softened, and athletes who would soon battle in the stadium sat side by side, tasting the same sacred food. Musicians played flutes, poets recited hymns celebrating Zeus, heroes, and past Olympic champions, and children ran between the crowds carrying olive leaves from the sacred grove. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the world were pausing for the ritual to settle across the land. Only once the sacrifices were accepted, only once Zeus was honored, could the games begin. Frederick would sit in these fragrant, haze-filled chambers, pondering law, science, religion, and why exactly his hands looked so interesting. It's no wonder the Pope once called him the Antichrist. He probably smelled the incense cloud drifting from Frederick's tent and thought, "That man is seeing God in ways we did not authorize." Frederick also experimented with hashish preparations brought by scholars who insisted it improved concentration. And to be fair, it did, at least until Frederick's concentration drifted into contemplating metaphysics so intensely that he forgot an entire council meeting while sitting in the same room. And the best part? Frederick conducted experiments on his own reactions to every substance. He documented effects, sensations, mood shifts, even philosophical insights. It was medieval journaling, except every entry probably began with, "Today I have discovered that time is fake." His court learned to adapt. If Frederick floated into a room, smiling with cosmic serenity, they knew not to bring up taxes. If he stormed in quoting Aristotle, they knew he'd tried a stimulant. If he wandered in slowly petting a falcon while muttering about the nature of existence, well, that was just a regular Wednesday. Frederick was brilliant, eccentric, unpredictable, and occasionally very, very high. If medieval courts had Yelp reviews, the Byzantine palace would have 5 stars for ambience, lighting, and absolutely overwhelming incense usage. And no one embraced this aromatic lifestyle more enthusiastically than Empress Theodora. A woman who ruled an empire, survived palace intrigue, and inhaled enough perfumed fumes to accidentally astral project during morning prayer. In Byzantium, incense wasn't just a small accessory. It was a cultural obsession, practically its own branch of government. Palaces, churches, corridors, throne rooms, everywhere you walked, clouds of scented smoke swirled like the empire's version of mood lighting. Henry was thus subjected to a rotating menu of medieval sleep aids, including poppy milk, a thick, white opiate mixture that monks hailed as a blessing but modern pharmacists would describe as, "Please, absolutely do not ingest this." Then there was mandrake wine, brewed from a root believed to scream when unearthed, always a reassuring sign for medicinal safety. He also endured henbane sleeping draughts, capable of inducing calm dreams, chaotic nightmares, or, occasionally, simply bypassing dreams altogether in favor of instant unconsciousness. Valerian and lavender-steeped ale were for those nights when they pretended to be gentle. Imagine being Henry. It's midnight. Your kingdom is metaphorically, and sometimes literally, on fire, and the royal doctor enters, carrying a cup that smells like a wizard's compost heap. "Drink this, sire. It will ease your troubles." Henry retorts, "Will it?" The doctor replies, "I have no idea, but you will definitely stop complaining." And sometimes the potions worked a little too well. Chroniclers noted that Henry frequently fell asleep at inopportune moments. During council meetings, during mass, and once, reportedly, during a heated argument about taxation, which might have been intentional. But these weren't peaceful, serene naps. Medieval sedatives hit like a trebuchet. Henry would go from wide awake to horizontal in seconds, only to awaken groggy, disoriented, and vaguely glowing from herbal residue. His sleep problems only worsened with age. Stress, illness, and politics transformed Henry into a man who practically subsisted on medicated potions. Each new rebellion merited a new dose, Each new political disaster, a stronger mixture. His physicians responded to national crises by stirring potions faster. The irony was that Henry wasn't a weak ruler. He was competent, strategic, and stubbornly effective. But insomnia made him volatile, irritable, and prone to pacing the halls at night like a ghost haunting its own castle. As the march commenced, Arminius rode at Varus's side, his face composed, his voice filled with feigned loyalty, his heart ablaze with purpose. He assured Varus the path was safe, that the tribes yearned for Roman guidance. He told Varus exactly what the governor wanted to hear, and beneath the veneer of polite smiles, the greatest ambush in Roman history was already inexorably unfolding. The march began beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Not an unusual omen in Germania, perhaps, but one the Romans should have heeded more closely. The Teutoburg forest was dense, ancient, and deeply hostile to travelers who relied on straight roads and open formations. Rome had built its empire on open terrain, where legions could spread their wings and unleash their devastating discipline. But in Germania, the trees closed in like suffocating walls. The ground turned to treacherous mud, and visibility shrank until the world became a narrow, claustrophobic corridor of dripping leaves. Varus, utterly oblivious, pressed forward. He had brought with him not just soldiers, but an entire civilian entourage. Cooks, smiths, merchants, servants, and even animals. This wasn't an army on high alert. It was a mobile administrative office. The columns stretched for miles, snaking through the forest paths like a silver serpent strangled by vines. And at the head of this unwieldy procession rode Arminius, offering guidance like the perfect, trusted ally. Then, at precisely the moment he needed to vanish, Arminius requested permission to gather allied Germanic troops to help suppress the fake rebellion he himself had concocted. Varus, utterly convinced of his loyalty, readily granted it. It was the last decision he made that wasn't steeped in bitter regret. As Arminius melted into the trees, the weather turned violently. Sheets of rain hammered the canopy. Wind howled through the branches. The muddy ground transformed into a treacherous swamp masquerading as a road. The wall began to stitch itself across the northern frontier like a jagged scar, marking the definitive boundary between the civilized world and the untamed wilderness beyond. But for the men who were forced to build it, the wall was not a marvel of engineering or a symbol of imperial might. It was a prison, a chain that bound them to a life of endless toil and suffering. And every stone they placed, every handful of earth they rammed into place, and every timber they hammered into the structure carried with it the lingering memory of someone who had fallen along the way. The emperor saw steady progress. The overseers saw unwavering discipline. But the workers saw only one stark, undeniable truth. This wall demanded more than just their labor. It demanded their very lives. As the wall stretched farther and farther across the vast expanse of the northern frontier, the staggering cost in human life became impossible to ignore, though the brutally efficient Qin state rarely bothered to try. Death was simply an expected expense, a negligible line item in the grand imperial ledger. Officials meticulously recorded supplies, tools, and precise measurements with unwavering precision, but they rarely kept accurate records of the dead. A man who collapsed from exhaustion was replaced before his body even had a chance to cool. A man buried alive in a landslide simply became another component of the vast earthwork. Illness spread rapidly through the overcrowded and unsanitary camps, bringing dysentery, raging fevers, frostbite, and agonizing infections from untreated wounds. For many laborers, the chances of survival dwindled with each passing day, becoming statistically less likely than an anonymous and unmourned death. Food shortages were a constant reality. The harsh frontier could not sustain large populations, and the overstretched empire struggled to transport sufficient grain across vast distances. For without the blessing of the Father of Gods, no victory meant anything, and without ritual, the Olympics were not competition. They were sacrilege. With the rituals complete and Zeus duly honored, the sanctuary of Olympia shifted from a solemn temple ground into the heart of the Greek world's greatest festival. The first official moment of the games was the opening procession, a spectacle that captured the spirit of unity the Olympics were meant to embody. At dawn, a trumpet blast echoed through the altis, bouncing off marble columns and rustling the sacred grove. Athletes, judges, officials, and heralds gathered at the entrance of the sanctuary, each representing a different city-state, each carrying the pride of their homeland on their shoulders. Despite Greece being a patchwork of independent and often hostile polis, the procession presented a vision of what unity could look like. Leading the march were the Hellenodikai, the judges of the games. Selected from the city of Elis, they trained for months to learn the rules, the rituals, and the proper conduct expected of Olympic officials. Dressed in flowing robes, they walked with solemn dignity, for their authority came not from law, but from Zeus himself. Behind them came the athletes, moving in orderly lines, bodies gleaming with oil, muscles carved by months of laborious training. Some bore the rugged physique of Spartans, hardened by discipline since childhood, while others carried the proud elegance of Athenian competitors, trained in gymnasia filled with philosophers and poets. Still others came from distant colonies, Magna Graecia in Italy, Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, even Cyrene in North Africa. When they marched together, they stretched across the sanctuary like a living tapestry of Greek identity. Following the athletes were ambassadors, musicians, priests, and representatives of various cities. Theodora loved these rituals. They were elegant, sacred, and occasionally strong enough to make you forget your own name. The fumes themselves weren't your gentle lavender spa oil. We're talking blue lotus resin, a known psychoactive, opium gum used to enhance contemplation, cannabis oils infused into burners as part of purification rites, and even incense from Persia and Egypt so potent that priests needed to open windows or risk floating out of their bodies mid-liturgy. Now, Theodora didn't intentionally inhale all this to get high. She inhaled it because it was everywhere. It was the palace equivalent of breathing. But when your palace air quality can be described as scented soup, effects are guaranteed. Picture Theodora sitting on her throne, receiving ambassadors from foreign lands. They enter the hall, eyes watering, noses overwhelmed, trying not to cough, while a fog of psychoactive aromatics fills the air like a mystical smoke machine. Meanwhile, Theodora, accustomed to this everyday occurrence, sits perfectly serene on her throne, exuding an aura of divine enlightenment. The ambassadors probably thought Byzantine emperors literally levitated. Her advisors often reported that Theodora entered states of heightened spiritual perception. Translation: the incense was working overtime, and court ceremonies were even stranger. Some rituals burned so many psychoactive resins that choir boys got dizzy and monks saw halos around everything, including the furniture. Theodora participated with regal composure, occasionally receiving visions or prophetic insights. Whether these insights came from God, genius, or the vapors is still an open scholarly debate. In private, her bathhouse rituals involved herbal steam infused with narcotic flowers that relaxed the muscles, eased stress, and probably made the palace walls breathe slightly if you stared too long. So yes, Theodora ruled an empire with sharp political instincts and fierce intelligence. So yes, Henry IV spent much of his reign drifting between exhaustion and potion-induced unconsciousness, a king ruling England on the medieval equivalent of prescription sleep grenades. Queen Catherine de Valois, mother of the Tudor dynasty and accidental instigator of half of England's future royal dramas, had one consistent approach to stress management, fumigation therapy, and not the gentle eucalyptus mist you find in modern spas. No, Catherine favored the medieval version, which was essentially sitting in a small, heated room, being slow-cooked in psychoactive vapor. Fumigation chambers were fashionable among the medieval elite. They were meant to cleanse the body, calm the spirit, and rebalance emotional imbalances. In practice, they functioned like herbal hotboxes designed by someone who had never heard of ventilation. Catherine's chambers burned cannabis resin, opium-infused oils, henbane smoke, and various mysterious royal herbs that physicians swore were medicinal, even though none of them could explain why everyone left the room walking into doorframes. Imagine Catherine entering the chamber after a particularly trying diplomatic disaster. She sits gracefully, every inch a queen, ready to unwind. Attendants close the door, a door that seals tighter than a medieval tax collector's purse. Then they ignite the herbal mixture, Slowly, the room fills with thick, aromatic smoke, the kind that makes you question whether the walls are melting or if your problems simply cease to exist. Within minutes, Catherine is experiencing relief, which was medieval medical code for Your Majesty. You probably won't feel feelings for at least 2 hours. Her physicians wrote lovingly about how the fumes loosened the humors, relaxed the womb, and freed the mind from sorrow, which, in modern terms, translates to we invented aromatherapy, but accidentally made it narcotic. Roman shields grew slick and unwieldy. Their sandals lost their grip. Wagons overturned in ditches. Cohesion disintegrated as soldiers struggled to maintain formation in terrain that punished every step. The Germans could not have asked for a more advantageous setting. Hidden behind branches, concealed in trenches, and positioned along natural ridges, warriors from multiple tribes waited. Men Arminius had personally rallied over months of clandestine meetings. Their bodies were painted for war, their weapons sharpened, and their fury honed by years of humiliation under Roman rule. They watched silently, patiently, letting the Romans sink deeper into the forest, deeper into vulnerability, deeper into the trap from which there would be no escape. Varus still believed he was marching toward a minor uprising. He had no idea that the true revolt was behind him, above him, and surrounding him on every side. Then, somewhere in the dripping green labyrinth, Arminius raised his arm, the signal he had waited years to give. The forest held its breath. The Romans marched blindly onward, and Germania prepared to strike. The first attack was not a grand clash of armies. It was a scream sharp, inhuman, echoing through the rain-soaked branches. A moment later, a volley of spears erupted from the tree line, tearing into the Roman column. Men collapsed before they even understood what was happening. The forest exploded with war cries, primal sounds that bypassed logic and struck directly into the core of the spine. Germania had been waiting decades for this moment, and it arrived like a storm unleashed from its chains. The Romans, trained for open-field combat, scrambled to form ranks, but the terrain betrayed them. Centurions shouted for order, but their voices were swallowed by the shrieking wind and the pounding rain. Shields offered scant protection against javelins hurled from above. Swords were too short to reach foes who struck and vanished back into the woods. When supplies ran dangerously low, the soldiers ate first, the overseers ate second, and the workers ate last, if anything at all remained. Some desperate laborers resorted to boiling tough grass into a bitter, almost inedible soup. Others chewed on discarded leather straps, hoping to trick their bodies into thinking they were being fed. Men weakened rapidly, and the weaker they became, the more likely they were to become the next day's casualties. Punishments for even minor infractions were brutal and carried out publicly as a warning to others. A man who slowed down the relentless pace of work could be tied to a post and whipped until he could stand again, or until he could not. Those accused of sabotage, disobedience, or attempted escape faced summary execution on the spot. Their bodies were sometimes buried directly under the wall itself, not out of any sense of ceremony or respect, but out of sheer practicality and grim convenience. Whether this constituted intentional entombment within the wall or simply careless disposal of corpses, the end result was the same. The wall became a vast, unmarked grave for countless unnamed souls. Despite the pervasive harshness and brutality, whispered rumors circulated among the desperate workers, offering a fragile glimmer of hope amid the despair. Some believed that the emperor fully intended the wall to last forever, not just as a physical barrier. A military defense was only part of the equation. The wall also stood as a lasting testament to Qin Shi Huang's reign. Some whispered that the emperor, gripped by a fear of death, sought immortality through structures that would outlive him. These rumors fueled the builders' resentment, as they suffered not for a noble cause or protection, but for the ambition of a single man. Yet, even amidst despair, flickers of humanity emerged. Workers shared meager rations, while seasoned veterans taught younger men how to protect their shoulders from the relentless burden. Many carried offerings, ornate bronze tripods, carved wooden statues, or dedications to Zeus and Hera. Chants and songs accompanied the march, blending reverence with celebration. The procession wound its way past the temples, the treasuries, and finally into the stadium, an elongated bowl carved into the landscape. There were no seats. Spectators stood or squatted on grassy embankments, thousands crowding shoulder to shoulder. When the athletes entered, a roar rose from the spectators, a thunderous greeting from all of Greece. In that moment, differences dissolved. Spartans stood near Athenians without exchanging insults. Argives applauded Corinthians, and families wept with pride as sons stepped into the arena of heroes. The opening procession did more than begin the games. It reminded a fractured world that for 5 sacred days, all Greeks walked the same ground, under the same sky, before the same god. When the procession ended and the athletes took their places, all eyes turned toward the stadium, an elongated grassy field. Carved directly into the earth, the original Olympic Stadium stood in stark contrast to the marble arenas of later times. Eschewing stone seating, imposing walls, and elaborate ornamentation, its simplicity was deliberate. The Greeks held that excessive grandeur would detract from the purity of competition and the presence of the divine. This wasn't mere entertainment. It was a sacred trial of human ability conducted before the gods themselves. The stadium stretched approximately 192 meters, the length of one stadium, the unit that gave the world the very word. Stone starting lines, worn smooth by countless bare feet over centuries, marked each end of the track. Spectators, a diverse assembly of men of all ages, lined the earthen embankments. Solemn priests, aristocrats draped in fine cloaks, travelers from distant lands, and even philosophers eager to witness physical ideals in action gathered to watch. But she also spent years breathing an incense haze so thick it could double as medieval anesthesia. If anyone in medieval Europe deserved an award for most unexpected ways to get high, King Philip the Fair of France would absolutely receive it, and he'd accept it inside a cathedral, surrounded by priests waving incense burners the size of medieval kettles. Philip the Fair was famous for many things: bankrupting the Knights Templar, picking fights with the Pope, and being unreasonably attractive, according to every chronicler who ever wrote about him. But what people forget is that Philip spent an astonishing amount of time in church. And these weren't mild, quiet church sessions. These were full medieval liturgical extravaganzas where the incense wasn't just present. It was aggressively unavoidable. Medieval church incense was nothing like the gentle sandalwood you find in modern yoga studios. Oh no, this was a powerful mixture of frankincense, myrrh, psychoactive tree resins from the Middle East, benzoin, storax, and occasionally herbs that encouraged divine visions, which is a polite ecclesiastical way of saying, sit too close and you will absolutely start seeing angels tap dancing on the altar. And King Philip didn't sit in the back row. Philip sat front and center, directly under the incense clouds, for hours. Imagine the scene. A grand cathedral filled with chanting monks, sunlight pouring through stained glass, and plumes of thick incense swirling dramatically around Philip's head like he's the main character in a medieval music video. While everyone else is quietly praying, Philip is inhaling enough aromatic resin to communicate with the Holy Spirit in surround sound. Priests insisted the purpose was spiritual elevation. Philip took that very seriously, sometimes a little too seriously. Court attendants occasionally had to escort Catherine out because she stayed too long and began philosophizing with the furniture. One chronicler politely noted that, after fumigation sessions, the queen spoke with great gentleness and contemplation, which is a diplomatic way of saying she was absolutely floating. Even ambassadors noticed. One Burgundian envoy described Catherine's presence as serene, luminous, and slightly unsteady. Another wrote that speaking with her felt like conversing through a warm cloud. These men weren't poets. They were simply surviving second-hand exposure. But the most amusing detail is that fumigation was prescribed for romantic vitality, yes, that kind. And considering Catherine famously married Owen Tudor in secret, thereby launching a new royal bloodline, one might argue that the fumes worked a little too well. So, while Catherine de Valois ruled with grace and left a dynasty behind, a significant portion of her emotional stability came from calmly sitting in a room filled with enough herbal smoke to tranquilize the Archbishop of Canterbury. King Alfonso X of Castile, known to history as Alfonso the Wise, earned his nickname not because he behaved wisely, but because he surrounded himself with scholars, astrologers, translators, poets, magicians, and basically anyone who could teach him something, whether that something was astronomy or how to brew a trance-inducing herbal tea in the palace basement. Alfonso believed that knowledge stemmed from three sources: books, the heavens, and drinking whatever his court philosophers handed him. And since medieval scholars were fond of experimenting with consciousness-altering herbs for research purposes, Alfonso became the lucky royal volunteer for half of Iberia's intellectual science projects. His court brewed concoctions made from mugwort, used by astrologers to open the mind to the stars, or to make you think constellations were winking at you. The forest was not a battlefield. It was an execution chamber. Arminius's warriors struck from all sides, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Small bands rushed forward to attack, then melted back into the undergrowth before the legions could respond. Others targeted officers, decapitating the chain of command before it could stabilize the line. Everywhere Varus looked, the trees themselves seemed alive with movement, shadows flickering, blades flashing, enemies attacking and vanishing like phantoms. Wagons overturned, blocking the narrow path. Horses panicked, trampling soldiers underfoot. Supply mules broke free and scattered into the forest. And as confusion spread, the rain intensified, transforming the ground into a sucking mire that trapped Roman sandals like inescapable snares. Discipline, Rome's greatest weapon, dissolved into pockets of terrified men fighting in isolated desperation. Varus attempted to regroup, ordering the construction of a fortified camp. But building defenses in the midst of such chaos proved nearly impossible. And while the Romans frantically dug trenches and erected makeshift walls from shields and debris, Germanic warriors continued their relentless harassment, raining spears into the half-built camp until nightfall. When darkness descended, it offered no respite. The Romans huddled together, soaked to the bone, trembling with cold and fear, listening to the taunting shouts echoing from the forest. Germania wasn't just attacking, it was savoring the moment. Warriors sang victory songs. Drums echoed like thunder. To the Romans, it sounded as if the forest itself was celebrating their impending doom. Varus tried to maintain the illusion of control, but even he could see the truth. They were not fighting an enemy. They were being hunted. And Arminius, the man he had trusted implicitly, was the hunter leading them into the abyss. By dawn, the Romans were no longer marching. They were fleeing in slow motion. At night, they sang songs of home, reminding each other of the lives they once lived before becoming nameless cogs in the emperor's machine. Still, the grim reality persisted. The wall grew, but men perished faster than the empire could replace them. Each completed section became a dual symbol, a triumph of engineering and a memorial to the thousands who lay buried beneath it. The wall rose, and with it, the emperor's shadow stretched ever longer. While laborers bore the physical weight of construction, soldiers stationed along the frontier paid their own heavy price. They were more than just guards. They were symbols of Qin authority, extensions of the emperor's iron will. Yet even their rigid discipline couldn't mask the fact that this was one of the most brutal postings in the empire. Many, once celebrated for their triumphs in Qin's unification wars, now found themselves atop windswept ridges, gazing at a horizon that promised only danger. Their duty was constant, each watchtower demanding round-the-clock vigilance, especially at night when the Xiongnu were most likely to strike. Huddled around meager fires, soldiers clutched their spears, listening to the distant sounds of unseen horses. The northern winds were as merciless as they were to the workers. Armor offered little warmth, and cloaks froze stiff. In winter, even breathing felt like inhaling shards of glass. Although soldiers received better rations than laborers, shortages were common. Supplies struggled to navigate mountain passes blocked by snow, and convoys faced constant ambush risks. When grain shipments failed to arrive, soldiers went hungry alongside the men they guarded. Unlike laborers, soldiers could not simply collapse from exhaustion. Any weakness at a guard post could doom an entire section of the frontier. Tensions inevitably flared between the two groups. Soldiers enforced order with strict authority, pushing the workers even when exhaustion made their hands tremble. Women, save for the priestesses of Demeter, were excluded. The games were strictly a male domain. A hush would fall as the herald stepped forward, raising his hand. His voice, amplified by the open air, announced the start of the stage race, the first and most ancient event. A full sprint from one end of the stadium to the other. Athletes took their positions, toes pressed into small grooves carved in the stone, bodies coiled tight. Their skin, glistening with olive oil and lightly dusted with sand for better grip, reflected the sun. There were no lanes, no starting pistol, only the herald's signal. A single trumpet note pierced the air, and the runners exploded forward. A roar erupted from the crowd as the athletes surged across the field, arms pumping, legs churning up dust. Collisions occurred, elbows were thrown, and bursts of desperate speed marked the frantic efforts of each man to prove himself not only fast but divinely favored. Victory often came down to mere inches. When the first runner crossed the finish line, a wave of shouts reverberated through the stadium. His name would be recorded for eternity, not just as a champion of his city, but as the victor of that Olympiad. But the sprint was only the beginning. The days that followed would bring wrestling, boxing, the brutal pancration, chariot races, and the pentathlon, a contest testing strength, skill, and all-around endurance. Standing in that stadium, amidst the thunder of feet and the cries of thousands, one truth became undeniable. The Olympic Games were more than a competition. They were a declaration of human potential, performed under the watchful gaze of Zeus himself, and every athlete who stepped onto that sacred ground knew he was there to prove mortal worthiness. While the sprint initiated the games, it served as the initial spark in a conflagration of athletic rivalry. Chroniclers describe Philip as deeply contemplative during Mass, often entering states of intense focus, staring fixedly at a single point on the wall as if decoding heaven's Wi-Fi password. Some diplomats claimed he occasionally emerged from ceremonies glowing with inspiration. Others said he emerged glazed over and smiling mysteriously, which is historians speak for medieval incense hit him like a truck. And he attended Mass constantly, not once a week, but daily, sometimes multiple times a day, which means Philip spent a significant portion of his royal life in a haze of sacred fumes potent enough to tranquilize a camel. Did he enjoy it? Absolutely. Did it influence his judgment? Let's just say outlawing the Templars and arresting a pope were very bold moves, and perhaps not the kind one makes completely sober. So yes, Philip the Fair ruled France with strategic brilliance, political ruthlessness, and a respiratory system perpetually filled with holy smoke. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was many things. A political mastermind, a cultural icon, a mother of kings, and the undisputed queen of making medieval men extremely nervous. But there's one part of Eleanor's life that rarely gets mentioned, her love of wine. And not just any wine, medieval wine. Enhanced wine, wine fortified with more herbs than a witch's pantry. See, medieval wine wasn't the delicate stuff you swirl gently while discussing philosophy. Medieval wine was basically grape juice with commitment issues. It was strong, unpredictable, and often improved with herbal additives designed to boost mood, stimulate creativity, or knock you out cold, depending on the blend. And Eleanor, she lived in Aquitaine, the wine capital of medieval Europe, a land where everyone had opinions about vintages, barrels, and grapes, and where the court poets were only as good as their nearest bottle. There were also mandrake microdoses because Alfonso believed they unlocked mathematical clarity, and blue lotus and cannabis teas, popular among Andalusian scholars for inducing meditative states. Finally, there were myrrh and cinnamon infusions which were supposed to stabilize the humors, but mostly stabilized Alfonso into not standing up for a while. If you walked into Alfonso's palace on a typical evening, you'd find a group of scholars sitting cross-legged on cushions, passing around scrolls and herbs in equal proportion, while Alfonso took detailed notes, like a man preparing for an exam assigned by God. He wasn't getting high for fun. He was getting high for research. Imagine him listening to a scholar describe a new herbal blend. Your Majesty, this one encourages astral insight. Alfonso replies, at last, something that might help me rewrite the legal code. And he did rewrite the legal code. Spain's most influential medieval law book, the Siete Partidas, was developed during this era of mystical scholarship. Some of those laws are so philosophical that you can absolutely tell someone was sipping something herbal while drafting them. Alfonso also studied astrology with such devotion that he held nighttime sessions under the stars, often after drinking vision wine, a mixture potent enough to make anyone think they understood planetary motion. And, honestly, his astronomical tables were shockingly accurate, proving that either the herbs worked or medieval Spain ran on pure chaotic genius. Foreign visitors described Alfonso as deeply contemplative, intensely focused, and occasionally lost in thought for long intervals. Translation: the king tried another experimental tea and is now communicating with Jupiter. But here's the thing, Alfonso was brilliant. He wrote poetry, commissioned translations, advanced science, unified legal systems, and preserved ancient wisdom. Exhaustion clung to them like a shroud of wet cloth. The makeshift camp they abandoned behind them looked less like a military fortification and more like the debris field of a disaster. Varus tried to restore order, but his voice had lost its authority. Men looked at him not as a general, but as a man who had led them into a living nightmare and had no idea how to lead them out. Arminius, meanwhile, had rejoined his warriors, no longer concealing his true allegiance. The calm Roman exterior had vanished, replaced by a fearsome Germanic war leader whose intimate knowledge of Roman tactics would now be used to orchestrate the annihilation of 3 entire legions. He divided his forces into flexible bands, each assigned to strategic choke points along the Romans' escape route. Every ravine, every slope, every bend in the forest had been carefully chosen in advance. Germania itself had become a vast, intricate trap, designed by someone who understood exactly how Roman formations needed to move and how to stop them from moving at all. As the Romans attempted to advance, the path narrowed to a ridge flanked by steep, treacherous drops. It was here that the next wave of the ambush crashed down. Germanic warriors rolled boulders and felled trees, crushing ranks and sealing off any chance of retreat. Javelins rained down again, but this time the Romans were too tightly packed to effectively maneuver their shields. Screams ricocheted through the chaos as soldiers toppled into the ravines, slipping on mud slicked with blood. Varus ordered the legions to break out, but his commands were swallowed by the escalating panic. The 17th Legion fell into disarray first. Its eagle standard, the very soul of the legion, was lost in the melee. When a Roman legion lost its eagle, it usually signified annihilation. Here, it was simply the first grim harbinger of what was to come. The 18th Legion suffered next, collapsing under relentless assaults from above. Yet many soldiers quietly sympathized, recognizing the same fear reflected in the laborers' eyes, fear of a landscape as deadly as any enemy. Some secretly shared food or water, small acts of kindness that risked severe punishment if discovered. And then there were the battles. As the wall was built, nomadic raiders launched sudden attacks to disrupt its progress, targeting isolated camps, supply caravans, and partially completed fortifications. Soldiers sprinted across the ridges to repel these assaults, often outnumbered and fighting on treacherous terrain. Many were lost, falling from cliffs or struck down before reinforcements could arrive. After each battle, the soldiers returned to their posts, knowing that their victories were temporary and their losses permanent. While intended for defense, the wall's construction felt more like a provocation, a stark reminder that Qin intended to claim the frontier. The soldiers understood a painful truth. They were defending a project still incomplete, still vulnerable, and still claiming lives every day. Even the army, the pride of Qin, felt the emperor's ambition pressing down like an inescapable weight. As months turned into years, the wall's construction became a relentless rhythm that consumed the frontier. Each day began the same. The overseer's whistle, the clatter of tools, and the trudge of thousands of feet toward the next unfinished section. Progress was measured not in miles, but in misery. How many men survived the day? How many collapses could be repaired? How many new sections could be forced into existence before nightfall? The wall did not grow in a straight, elegant line. It twisted along ridges, followed mountain contours, and dipped into valleys where the earth was pliable. Different regions yielded different styles. Packed earth in the west, stone layers in the northern mountains, timber fortifications in forested areas. The ancient Olympics unfolded as a carefully curated series of events designed not merely to entertain, but to gauge the full spectrum of human prowess. To triumph at Olympia was to achieve a form of immortality, for the Greeks believed that true excellence, arete, was the closest mortals could come to divinity. One of the most esteemed competitions was wrestling, a testament to strength, balance, and sheer willpower. Wrestlers, coated in olive oil and then dusted with sand for enhanced grip, entered the sandy arena like statues brought to life, their hair bound. Victory was awarded to the athlete who forced his opponent to touch the ground 3 times. The battles were silent, intense, and deceptively graceful, 2 bodies intertwined in a dance that tested every muscle, every breath. Then came boxing, a far more brutal affair than its modern counterpart. Fighters wrapped their hands in leather thongs called himantes, sometimes reinforced with wool or metal. There were no rounds, no weight classes, and no time limits. The match concluded only when one contestant collapsed, surrendered, or died. Faces were pulverized, ribs cracked, and teeth scattered across the sand. Yet spectators revered these boxers, believing their courage honored Zeus. The pancration, however, was the ultimate test of fearlessness. A blend of wrestling and boxing with virtually no rules. Kicking, holds, chokes, throws, and joint locks were all permitted. Only biting and eye gouging were forbidden, though desperate athletes occasionally resorted to them anyway. Victors of the pancration were celebrated as the strongest, most indomitable warriors in Greece. Olympians who triumphed in this event often went on to lead armies or become legendary figures in their home cities. The pentathlon, showcasing versatility, comprised the discus, javelin, long jump, a short sprint, and wrestling. Pentathletes were admired for their harmonious blend of speed, agility, and precision. Court records describe Eleanor hosting feasts where the wine flowed freely and came mixed with delightful additions like wormwood, which made the mind wander into interesting and occasionally alarming places. Hip and rosemary, which lifted the spirits. Poppy syrup, which guaranteed you would sleep like a blessed corpse afterward. And cannabis seeds steeped in wine to encourage poetic invention, a medieval phrase meaning, "You will absolutely write something dramatic tonight." It wasn't recreational, it was courtly culture, a sophisticated excuse. Really, imagine a court poet nervously performing for Eleanor. She sits with her golden hair braided into a crown, sipping a goblet of herb-infused Aquitanian wine that could knock the armor off a Templar, nodding slowly as she evaluates whether the poem is brilliant, or if she just can't feel her face anymore. And the troubadours loved it. They claimed Eleanor's wine unlocked inspiration, which is medieval code for, "We drank something and started rhyming uncontrollably." Entire poetic movements were born because someone poured too much wormwood into the barrel. But Eleanor wasn't using these concoctions for escapism. She used them for strategy. A relaxed court is easier to control, a creatively inspired court produces better propaganda, and a mildly intoxicated diplomat is far easier to win arguments against. Plus, let's be honest, if you'd married King Henry II, you'd probably need a drink, too. Eleanor's enhanced wine wasn't a weakness. It was a political tool, a cultural signature, and occasionally a spiritual journey. And through it all, she remained one of the most powerful and sharp-minded rulers of the medieval age, even if her wine occasionally had the kick of a small dragon. King Louis IX, later known as St. He just happened to do it while occasionally hovering at the outer edge of consciousness. Empress Irene of Byzantium was many things. Shrewd politician, occasional usurper, enthusiastic blinder of rivals. But she was also a woman who spent so much time surrounded by incense that her entire reign might as well have taken place inside a perfumed fog bank. If you've ever walked past an overly enthusiastic incense booth at a festival, imagine that, but make it imperial policy. Byzantine religious and political life revolved around ceremonial incense, and Irene took those ceremonies very seriously. Her court burned mountains of the stuff: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, storax, benzoin resin from distant mountains, and, depending on the ritual, herbs known for their vision-enhancing effects. In the 9th century, vision-enhancing was code for "Your Majesty, you may see God," or something that vaguely resembles him. When ambassadors visited, Irene ensured they encountered a majestic haze of fragrant smoke, so thick it could hide an entire infantry unit. Diplomats walked into her throne room blinking, coughing politely, and trying not to trip over furniture they could no longer see. Meanwhile, Irene sat perfectly poised in the center of this aromatic hurricane, like a serene, slightly glowing deity. Chroniclers described her as radiant, spiritually elevated, and calm beyond earthly worry. Yes, that's what happens when you spend your days marinating in incense capable of numbing half the nervous system. She probably handled political stress the same way a spa client handles hot stones, with quiet resignation and mild hallucination. Her private chapel was even more intense. Irene loved long devotional sessions involving chanting monks, candlelight, and incense burners that didn't just waft. They erupted fumes like volcanoes specially designed to bless you. Priests swung censers in wide arcs, filling the room until theology became a full-body experience. Entire cohorts were pinned against the slope, unable to climb, unable to fight, unable to escape. The Germans attacked with a ferocity fueled by years of subjugation. Each blow was a defiant rejection of Roman domination. As for the 19th Legion, it was surrounded, cut off, and slowly strangled by successive ambushes. A legion trained to fight in open fields now died in fragments, scattered throughout the dripping forests that turned every tree into a potential spear, every shadow into a lurking killer. Varus realized he had lost not just a battle, but the Empire's aura of invincibility. Somewhere amid the wreckage of men and armor, one chilling truth settled over the survivors like a burial shroud. This was no mere revolt. This was retribution. By the third day, the Teutoburg forest had become a vast, unmarked graveyard. The Romans were not simply defeated. They were erased. 3 legions that had once been the pride of the empire no longer existed. Their eagle standards were lost to the mud and the trees. Their officers lay scattered among the broken equipment, crushed wagons, and corpses half buried in the swampy soil. And somewhere in the chaotic aftermath, Varus, finally comprehending the full magnitude of his failure, fell on his own sword, choosing death over the unbearable humiliation of capture. When word reached Rome, Emperor Augustus reportedly tore his robes, shouting in anguish, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" But there were no legions to give back. Arminius had not simply won a battle. He had torn a gaping hole in Roman history that would never fully heal. For the Germans, the victory was earth-shattering. Tribes that had once squabbled over grazing land suddenly stood united in triumph. Arminius was hailed as a liberator, a man who had accomplished the seemingly impossible, humiliating the greatest military power in the known world. This patchwork reflected the frantic pace of Chian expansion. Build whatever you can, as long as it stands tall and stands now. For the laborers, the wall's progression felt surreal. They might awaken to an empty ridge, barren except for scattered rocks, only to see it crowned by nightfall with a rampart, crude but imposing, the product of thousands of hands breaking, hauling, pounding, and shaping the landscape. Workers often stared at these newly raised segments with a numb mix of awe and despair. They were building a monument larger than themselves, yet they had no claim to it. Their names would never be recorded, and their families would never know where they died. Still, the work never stopped. In rainy seasons, mud turned to a clinging glue, sucking off shoes and trapping carts until teams of men dragged them free. In dry seasons, dust storms swallowed entire work sites, forcing laborers to cover their faces with scraps of cloth and hammer earth into place by feel alone. Thunderstorms shattered scaffolds, and earthquakes collapsed sections that had taken months to construct. Each disaster meant repeating the same grueling tasks with even fewer survivors. The empire kept sending more men, fresh criminals, newly conscripted peasants, political offenders. Some arrived defiant, others terrified, but all eventually succumbed to the same crushing exhaustion. They were absorbed into the machine, into the slow, relentless march of expansion. A man had no past on the frontier, only the wall in front of him and the overseer behind. As the wall stretched farther, laborers whispered a bitter phrase. The wall grows, the empire grows, but we grow fewer. Yet the project persisted, driven by a single, unwavering truth. Qin Shi Huang demanded a barrier that would reshape the world, and the world, unwillingly, was being reshaped stone by stone, life by life. As the wall crept across the frontier like a giant scar, its purpose expanded far beyond mere defense. Watching a discus arc through the air or a javelin whistle across the field was akin to witnessing mastery in motion, a reminder that the Olympics celebrated beauty as much as raw strength. And then there were the equestrian events, held not in the stadium itself but in the sprawling hippodrome. Chariot races were chaotic, violent, and exhilarating spectacles. Horses collided, chariots overturned, and dust storms enveloped entire teams. But victory brought immense glory, not to the driver, but to the wealthy owner who financed the team. Every event at Olympia showcased a different facet of human excellence. Some emphasized precision, others courage, still others pure endurance, but all of them, in their unique way, paid homage to the gods, proving that mortals could shine brilliantly, even if only for a fleeting moment under the sun. Victory at the ancient Olympics wasn't decided by medals, national anthems, or podium ceremonies. It was determined in a singular moment, a judge raising his hand and declaring one name aloud. And with that declaration, an athlete was inducted into immortality. Winners were summoned to the temple of Zeus, where the air was thick with incense and the echoes of hymns. Before an assembly of priests, judges, and thousands of spectators, each victor stood bare-chested, bruised, exhausted, and yet radiant with triumph. His body bore the marks of battle, scratches from wrestling, swollen knuckles from boxing, dust and sweat caked on his skin. But none of it diminished his glory. To win at Olympia was to be touched by divine favor. The crowning ceremony commenced with praise to Zeus. A priest cut branches from the sacred olive tree, believed to have been planted by Heracles himself. These branches, long and slender, were woven into a simple wreath, the kotinos. No gold, no jewels, just olive leaves, symbols of peace, virtue, and purity. Yet this simplicity was deceptive, for this wreath carried more weight than any treasure. Lewis had a reputation for being pious, disciplined, noble, charitable, and occasionally so spiritually elevated that people wondered if he was communing with angels, or simply overscented with medieval medicinal herbs. Spoiler, probably both. Lewis took religion seriously, very seriously, pathologically seriously. If holiness were a competitive sport, Lewis would have won by such a margin that the Pope would have to start drug testing. But medieval sainthood didn't just come from charity and crusading. It also came from medicinal concoctions cooked up by court physicians whose idea of help involved stuffing sedatives into anything that moved. And when Lewis experienced stress, which was often, because ruling France in the 13th century was basically living inside a non-stop group project, his doctors prescribed spiritual calming treatments. Translation: medieval herbal potions strong enough to make a statue blink. Lewis's medical lineup included poppy-based syrups, which monks labeled sleeping cordial, but which modern doctors would call, please do not operate heavy machinery after drinking this. Valerian infusions meant to quiet the mind, but also capable of quieting your ambition, personality, and probably a small village. Henbane extracts, which open the mind to spiritual truths, usually right before closing the mind to basic motor skills. And myrrh and resin vapors burned during devotions, thick enough to make the chapel look like a medieval rock concert. The result? Lewis often slipped into contemplative trances so deep that his advisors sometimes had to wave their hands in front of his face to check whether he was having a divine revelation or just extremely relaxed. Chroniclers, who were far too respectful to call their future saint medicated, instead described these episodes as periods of severe devotion, which is medieval historian code for the incense did something. His intense prayer sessions frequently lasted hours. One monk wrote that Irene's prayers were accompanied by visions. Based on how much resin they were burning, those visions could have included angels, saints, or possibly a talking mosaic on the wall. Whatever she saw, it must have been inspiring because Irene made some bold political decisions afterward, including blinding her own son to secure power. Let's just say incense alone cannot be blamed, but it certainly didn't hurt her sense of dramatic timing. Her bath rituals were equally aromatic. Heated rooms infused with medicinal herbs created a steam so potent that attendants sometimes needed breaks to avoid walking sideways afterward. So yes, Empress Irene ruled an empire with cunning, faith, and unwavering imperial authority. She also ruled from inside a cloud of incense strong enough to make a basilica levitate. Few medieval rulers achieved the tragic, chaotic, medically induced notoriety of King Charles VI of France, also known by the extremely subtle nickname Charles the Mad. But here's the twist. Much of his infamous instability stemmed not just from illness, but from the heroic quantities of medicinal substances his court physicians kept pouring into him, like medieval bartenders who skipped the part about moderation. Charles began his reign relatively stable, intelligent, charming, and capable. Then he experienced a sudden mental breakdown while marching with his army. One moment he was planning strategy, the next he was attacking his own knights because he believed they were imposters sent to kill him. Medieval burnout was no joke. Naturally, his doctors responded with their favorite solution. "Your Majesty, you need more herbs." And when medieval physicians said herbs, they did not mean chamomile. Charles was given nightshade microdoses, which is already a red flag. No dosage of nightshade should be called micro in the 1300s. The forest where the ambush had taken place became sacred ground, proof that cunning and courage could triumph over imperial arrogance. And yet, victory carried its own burdens. Arminius was no longer simply a military commander. He was a symbol, and symbols inevitably attract rivals. Some chieftains feared he aspired to become a king, the very thing Germans traditionally despised. His uncle, Segestes, who had long harbored animosity toward him, repeatedly denounced him to Rome and encouraged internal opposition. Political fractures began to reappear. Tribal leaders who had briefly united against Varus now reverted to their old grudges, their temporary alliance dissolving under the corrosive weight of personal ambition. Rome, though wounded, was far from broken. Germanicus, the famed general and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, launched multiple campaigns to avenge the Teutoburg disaster. He defeated Arminius in several open battles, recovered some of the lost eagle standards, and demonstrated that Rome still possessed formidable power. But even Germanicus could not fully conquer Germania. The land was too wild, the tribes too scattered, and the resistance too fierce. Arminius survived Rome's reprisals, but not those of his own people. His growing power frightened rival nobles, who saw in him the looming shadow of monarchy. In 21 CE, they assassinated him, a liberator slain not by invaders, but by the very leaders he had fought to free. Arminius died at the relatively young age of 37, but his legacy endured, the man who had stopped Rome and ensured that Germania would never become another Roman province. When Qin Shi Huang finally unified the warring states in 221 BCE, he was not content with simply ending centuries of bloodshed. He wanted to fundamentally reshape China itself. Its laws, its infrastructure, its very identity, and, crucially, its borders. And he expected those borders to remain peaceful. Qin Shi Huang wanted not only to keep invaders out, but also to keep his empire in. The wall became a visible symbol of his authority, stretching farther than any messenger could travel in a day. A physical declaration that the emperor's reach extended into the most remote and desolate corners of the world. It was as if he were carving his name into the very landscape, demanding that all who looked upon it remember who commanded heaven and earth. For many in the empire, the wall became a symbol of dread rather than pride. Stories circulated about men dragged from their homes simply for criticizing imperial reforms, sentenced to labor on the frontier until their bones gave out. Families whispered warnings to their children. Obey the law, or the wall will claim you. The very mention of the northern work sites could silence a crowd. It was widely believed that those who vanished into the construction camps were rarely seen again, a truth not far removed from the rumors. Officials, too, used the wall as political leverage. A rival bureaucrat might be accidentally assigned to oversee a remote section, a subtle death sentence disguised as a promotion. Even nobles feared offending the wrong minister, for the wall was an equalizer in the most brutal sense, stripping away wealth, rank, and privilege. On the frontier, everyone answered to the emperor alone. Yet Qin propaganda spun a different tale. Court poets and scholars praised the wall as a dragon of protection, a sacred shield guarding the realm from chaos. Travel records described it as the greatest engineering achievement in history. Statues and inscriptions celebrated the emperor's benevolence in securing peace for future generations. But those who actually worked on the wall knew the truth. It was built with more cruelty than stone. Still, the wall did its job. The Xiongnu, unnerved by its rapid expansion, retreated farther north, uncertain how to confront a barrier that grew faster than they could tear it down. It proclaimed to all of Greece that the victor had achieved Eurity, the highest standard of excellence. His name would be etched into eternity. His city-state would celebrate him as a hero. Poets might immortalize him in verse, and sculptors might carve his likeness for the altars. Families would recount his deeds for generations. As the wreath was placed on the victor's head, the crowd erupted, not with polite applause, but with thunderous shouts, chants of his name, and sometimes tears. People who had journeyed hundreds of miles felt privileged to witness history. Children stared with shining eyes. Old warriors nodded with respect. Even rivals, those he had vanquished, often embraced him, acknowledging the divine nature of his achievement. But the celebration didn't end at Olympia. When champions returned home, they were greeted as conquering heroes. City gates were sometimes torn down so that the victor could enter through a breach, symbolizing that his triumph had made the city stronger. Some received free meals for life. Others were granted pensions, statues, or even political office. Yet, most champions maintained that these earthly honors were secondary. What truly mattered was the wreath itself, the knowledge that they had honored Zeus, honored their city, and proven themselves worthy before all of Greece. For in the sacred valley of Olympia, even the briefest moment of victory reverberated across the centuries, carried on the leaves of a simple olive crown. When the final contest concluded and the victors were crowned, Olympia gradually returned to its sacred quiet. Athletes packed their gear, priests extinguished the ritual fires, and caravans began the long journey home. But the echo of the games didn't fade. It lingered, carried in songs, inscribed on stone, and immortalized in memory. What transpired in Olympia every 4 years was more than a mere festival. It was a cultural engine powerful enough to outlive kingdoms, wars, and shifting civilizations. He knelt motionless, eyes half closed, basking in clouds of resin smoke, whispering prayers, visions, or possibly recipe ideas. Nobody could hear him clearly over the incense burners hissing like medieval humidifiers. Foreign diplomats who attended these ceremonies reported feelings of euphoria, lightness, and holy dizziness. One ambassador admitted he forgot why he had come and simply joined Louis in prayer. The incense absolutely worked. But here's the twist. Louis's judgment remained sharp. His administrative decisions were famously fair, his justice system admired, and his reforms lasting. So either the herbs sharpened his saintly instincts, or he was the only man in history to run a country from inside a mildly narcotic haze and still do it better than his sober rivals. In the end, Louis didn't get high for pleasure. He got high for God, which in medieval Europe was the most respectable excuse imaginable. Emperor Basil I began life as a stable boy, rose to power through charm, talent, and one very suspicious series of promotions, and eventually ruled the Byzantine Empire with the confidence of a man who absolutely believed God was on his side. And to be fair, Basil was often on his way to feeling divine, thanks to one of the empire's most beloved psychoactive imports, blue lotus. Blue lotus, a fragrant Egyptian flower, had been used for centuries in rituals, medicine, and elevated social gatherings, which is historian speak for the ancient world's favorite mild hallucinogen. Basil adored it, not because he wanted to party, but because the palace absolutely drowned in the stuff. Incense braziers, bathhouses, perfumed oils, ceremonial garlands, the blue lotus was everywhere, turning Basil's daily routine into a pleasantly floaty sensory experience. Imagine waking up as emperor. You step into your bath, blue lotus steam. You walk through the palace, blue lotus incense. You sit on your throne, attendants waving fans dipped in blue lotus oil. Then there were henbane elixirs, believed to calm storms of the mind. though they also caused mild paralysis and visionary episodes. Poppy syrups were consumed as casually as tea, and cannabis resins were burned in his chambers during episodes of agitation. Myrrh and resin vapors were also deployed because if it worked for priests, maybe it would work for France's most stressed-out king. The intentions were noble, but the results were mixed at best. Imagine Charles pacing through the palace mid-episode, convinced he was made of glass. Yes, he sincerely believed this, while attendants tiptoed around him, carrying bowls of steaming herbal mixtures strong enough to stupefy a choir boy. There was even a rule in the palace. No one was allowed to touch him suddenly, because he feared he would shatter. His servants walked around him like he was a very anxious chandelier. Now, combine this fragile mental state with continuous doses of medieval sedatives that would make modern psychiatrists faint, and you have a king who drifted through reality like a balloon someone forgot to tie down. And yet, Charles had lucid periods. During those rare windows, he expressed heartbreaking awareness of his condition. But the moment he showed distress, his doctors hurried forward with yet another potion that promised clarity and delivered something closer to, "Please lie down before you fall down." His illness was real, and his suffering was immense. But the treatments often made things worse. By the end of his life, Charles VI wasn't so much ruling France as floating through it, caught between madness, medicine, and a kingdom praying he wouldn't wander off barefoot into the courtyard again. And that concludes our list of those monarchs existing in a medicinal haze not entirely of their own making. Arminius's life began far from marble villas and marching legions. The northern frontier, however, had no intention of cooperating. Beyond the cultivated fields and newly conquered towns lay the steppes, home to the Xiongnu, nomadic horsemen who rode like the wind, raiders who appeared and vanished before infantry could form ranks, and enemies who simply refused to recognize the very concept of a fixed frontier. For generations, these northern nomads had harassed the states of Zhao, Yan, and Qin. Their swift cavalry could cross vast distances in a single day, burning settlements and seizing livestock with impunity. Now that the first emperor ruled over a unified land, he had no patience for an enemy that didn't respect walls or the men who built them. His solution was ambitious, brutal, and terrifying in its scale. He ordered the linking and reinforcement of the old border fortifications built by the defeated states. What had once been scattered defensive lines would be transformed into a single, continuous barrier stretching across mountains, deserts, and untamed wilderness. The idea wasn't entirely novel. The states of Qin, Zhao, and Yan had already experimented with walls centuries earlier, but Qin Shi Huang envisioned something far grander. A colossal spine of stone, earth, and wood that would permanently mark the northern limit of civilization and keep the barbarians out. It wasn't simply a military project. It was a symbolic act, a grandiose declaration of permanence from a ruler obsessed with enshrining his reign for eternity. But even the most ambitious visions come with a cost, and the emperor had a characteristically ruthless solution to the inevitable labor shortages. He would use those who had displeased him. Tens of thousands of conscripted peasants, disgraced soldiers, debtors, and condemned prisoners were dispatched to the northern frontier. Many had been punished for criticizing imperial reforms, failing to pay taxes, or even simply being related to someone who had offended a powerful official. Patrols reported fewer raids, and farmers along the inner frontier began to sleep with a little less fear. The emperor's vision, for all its brutality, was shaping the geopolitical landscape. But beneath this veneer of stability, resentment simmered. Every clenched fist, every unmarked grave, every family mourning son's loss to the frontier carried a quiet, dangerous question. How long can an empire stand if it is mortared with suffering? The wall rose higher, the emperor's power grew heavier, and the foundations of rebellion were quietly being laid. By the time Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, the wall stretched across thousands of li, from the deserts of the west to the rugged mountains of the east. It was not a single, continuous structure as later dynasties would refine it, but it was vast enough to intimidate enemies and awe travelers. More importantly, it had reshaped the identity of the empire. The Qin Wall was both a grand achievement and an open wound, one that pulsed with stories of suffering whispered across generations. After the emperor's death, The state he built unraveled with brutal speed. His successors proved incapable of holding together the lands he had unified, and rebellion erupted across the empire. The harsh laws he imposed, the taxes he demanded, and the relentless construction projects he forced on the population had poisoned public sentiment. The wall, once portrayed as a protective dragon, was now remembered as a monument to oppression. Many veterans of the frontier joined the uprisings, carrying with them scars, both physical and emotional, from their years on the northern ridge. When the Qin dynasty fell and the Han rose in its place, the new rulers inherited the fractured remains of the wall. Instead of abandoning it, they chose to rebuild and expand it, recognizing its strategic value. But unlike the Qin, the Han used diplomacy alongside force, forging alliances with some nomadic groups while reinforcing vulnerable stretches. The games became a marker of time itself. Greeks measured history not by dynasties or conquests, but by Olympiads, 4-year cycles that bound the Greek world together in a shared timeline. A victory at the Olympics wasn't simply an athletic achievement. It was a moment etched into the calendar of an entire civilization. Cities boasted of their champions the way others boasted of walls or temples. A single triumph at Olympia could elevate a modest place into prominence. What made the games truly enduring, however, was their spirit of unity. Every 4 years, rivals became pilgrims, enemies became spectators, and Greece remembered, briefly but powerfully, that it was a cultural family bound by language, religion, and tradition. The Olympics kept alive the notion of a shared Greek identity, even during centuries when politics tore the region apart. Philosophers, playwrights, and historians lauded the games as the purest expression of arete, the striving for excellence in body, mind, and soul. As centuries passed, the festival expanded. New events were added, new temples were built, and artists, poets, and sculptors flocked to Olympia to showcase their works. Victors commissioned statues of themselves, some standing proudly, others depicting the precise pose that secured their victory in a race or match. For many spectators, walking through Olympia felt like strolling through a gallery of living legends. But nothing lasts forever. When Rome eventually conquered Greece, the games persisted, but gradually changed. Roman emperors competed for glory, and wealth overshadowed purity. Eventually, in the 4th century CE, the Christian Roman Empire banned pagan festivals. Olympia fell silent, temples crumbled, and the sacred fire was extinguished. Yet the memory never died. Centuries later, when modern nations sought a symbol of peaceful competition and shared humanity, they looked back to Olympia. By lunchtime, Basil wasn't just emperor, he was gently levitating emotionally, spiritually, and probably politically. Chroniclers say Basil had a serene composure and a calm authority. Of course, he did. It's easy to stay calm when the air around you smells like an ancient spa and your brain is receiving soft floral whispers of shhh. Don't worry about the taxes. He was born among the Cherusci, a forest people whose world consisted of rivers, oak groves, and warriors who believed that freedom was sacred enough to die for. But Rome, as always, had different ideas. In the late 1st century BCE, the empire was expanding into Germania, and peace often came with a contract signed in blood. Tribal princes were taken to Rome as hostages, though not as prisoners in chains. No, the Romans were far more elegant with their control. These children were insurance policies, raised in the capital to ensure their tribes behaved. Arminius was one of them. Imagine being 8 years old and being led away from your homeland, watching your mother vanish behind the tree-line as Roman cavalry escorted you south. You're not shackled, but you understand perfectly well that you're not going home anytime soon. To the Romans, this wasn't cruelty but strategy. If the boy grew up Roman in taste, loyalty, and ambition, he would return as a collaborator. A German body, but a Roman mind. In Rome, Arminius learned Latin, philosophy, warfare, and the subtle art of being useful to an empire that considered his people uncivilized. He dined with aristocrats, studied under generals, and observed how power was created, commanded, and enforced. He wasn't treated like a barbarian. Ironically, he was treated too well. Rome made sure its hostages were comfortable, educated, and flattered, because comfort is the softest kind of chain. Still, even as he absorbed Roman tactics and etiquette, the contrast must have gnawed at him. Here he was, a young noble of the Charusai, listening to Roman instructors mock the tribes of Germania as primitive brutes. The same tribes who had sent their children as hostages to avoid annihilation. The same tribes who still whispered Arminius's name at winter feasts, unsure if he was even alive. By the time he reached adulthood, Arminius was no longer simply a German prince. Now they marched north in chains, uncertain whether they would actually build a wall, simply freeze to death on a mountainside, or vanish into the vast, unforgiving landscape. Qin Shi Huang's architects assured him that the wall could be built. His generals assured him that the wall would be worthwhile. His officials assured him that the people would obey. And so the project began, a colossal undertaking meant to secure an empire, define a civilization, and leave behind a monument that would outlast every man who touched it. A monument that would become, for many, not a wall, but a tomb. The imperial decree to build the wall spread through the newly unified empire like a winter wind, cold, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Imperial officials appeared in villages and towns armed with wooden tablets listing names, quotas, and dire penalties for non-compliance. Men between the ages of 15 and 50 were expected to serve. Farmers were torn from their fields, artisans from their workshops, and soldiers from their barracks. Some went willingly, genuinely believing the emperor's promise of strengthened borders and lasting peace. Most went because outright refusal meant certain death. Qin law was notoriously unforgiving, and the wall was built on that foundation of unrelenting severity. For many families, the moment of conscription felt like a funeral. Mothers watched their sons depart, knowing that the northern frontier was a place where even seasoned soldiers feared to tread. Wives stood silently as their husbands were marched away in chains, uncertain if they would ever see them again. The emperor's decree made no distinction between the innocent and the merely unlucky. Even those accused of minor infractions, late payment of taxes, unregistered tools, perceived disrespect toward local officials, found themselves branded as laborers and shipped to the harshest work sites in the realm. The wall, once a symbol of the first emperor's obsession, now served a more practical purpose, a managed frontier rather than an impassable barrier. Yet the legacy of the Qin Wall remained unmistakable. In folktales and songs, it became known as the structure where 10,000 men died, a place where the earth itself held the bones of the forgotten. Archaeologists would later discover graves near ancient sections, confirming what workers had always murmured. The wall consumed lives as readily as it repelled enemies. Even today, stories persist of spirits wandering the old ramparts, echoes of men who never returned home. But despite its grim origins, the wall influenced centuries of Chinese defense strategy and ultimately inspired the far more famous structures we now associate with the Great Wall. Without the Qin, there would be no massive stone ramparts snaking across mountaintops, no watchtowers piercing the sky, no monumental testament to human endurance. In the end, the Qin Wall stands as a paradox, a masterpiece built from misery, a shield forged through suffering, and a reminder that even the greatest monuments cast long shadows. The wall survived its makers, but their stories remain buried within it, silent, unmarked, and eternal. Long before the roar of modern crowds or the gleam of international stadiums, the Olympic Games were born in a quiet, fertile valley in the western Peloponnese. Olympia was not a bustling city or a political powerhouse. It was a sanctuary, an ancient grove where the Greeks believed the presence of gods lingered in the rustling leaves. Here, amidst wild olive trees, marble altars, and the scent of burning offerings, the earliest foundations of the games took shape. The year 776 BCE would later be named the first Olympiad, but the truth was far older. No one can say when the Greeks first gathered to honor Zeus with physical contests. They revived the games, not as a religious festival, but as a global celebration of athletic excellence. Today's Olympics, with all their spectacle, technology, and worldwide reach, are direct descendants of that humble sprint in 776 BCE. What began in a sacred grove with offerings to Zeus has become a tradition that spans continents, a reminder that even in a divided world, humanity can unite, if only for a moment, to honor the extraordinary potential of the human spirit. Rome had crafted him into a knight of the equestrian order. A trained commander, loyal in theory to the emperor, fluent in Latin, disciplined in Roman military doctrine, and fully aware of how legions lived, marched, and died. Rome believed it had shaped him. Rome believed it had tamed him. What it had actually done was far more dangerous. It had taught Arminius exactly how to destroy it. When Arminius reached adulthood, Rome considered him one of its own, or at least close enough to pass in uniform. The boy taken from the forests of Germania had become a polished officer of the Roman auxiliary forces, a knight in the equestrian order, and exactly the kind of foreign-born commander Rome loved to parade as proof of its civilizing mission. Arminius wore the Roman cloak, carried the Roman sword, and rode beside generals who assumed he admired everything the empire represented. And, to be fair, Rome had given him power, real power. As a commander of auxiliary cavalry, Arminius fought in campaigns along the Danube, putting down rebellions and testing his skill against enemies who did not yet know his name. He learned how legions deployed across open fields, how Roman engineers fortified camps overnight, how officers relayed orders, and, perhaps most importantly, how overconfident Roman commanders became when facing people they considered inferior. Every victory Rome gained taught Arminius something. Every battle honed his instincts. He even earned citizenship and the coveted equestrian rank from Emperor Augustus himself, a badge of honor Romans would have killed for. From the outside, Arminius looked like the poster child for assimilation. A barbarian turned Roman, a success story of imperial ideology. He could sit at Roman banquets, quote Roman poets, and command soldiers without anyone questioning his loyalty. But Rome had made one miscalculation. They thought Arminius had forgotten where he came from. Myths offered competing stories. Some claimed Heracles, fresh from performing his legendary labors, established the games to thank Zeus for granting him strength. Others insisted that Pelops, a hero whose chariot victory won him a kingdom, founded them to commemorate his divine triumph. Every version shared one theme. The games began where humans sought to reach toward the divine. Olympia's sacred identity made it the perfect stage. Unlike the warring city-states scattered across Greece, the sanctuary belonged to no single polis. Its temples, treasuries, and altars were neutral ground, protected by religious law. Even enemies were expected to behave with reverence upon entering its boundaries. And because the Greeks believed Zeus watched from above, every athlete who entered the arena carried not only the pride of their city but the weight of divine judgment. But the games were not created merely to entertain. They were offerings, gifts of strength, endurance, and courage presented to the gods. Victories brought honor not just to the athlete but to Zeus himself. Losing was not shameful. Failing to give one's best effort was. It was said that an athlete must compete for the glory of Zeus alone, a reminder that ambition was allowed, but arrogance was not. As pilgrims gathered from distant lands, Sparta, Corinth, Athens, Elis, they arrived with the same one might bring to a sacred pilgrimage, bearing sacrifices, prayers, and hopes. Before any race could begin, before any athlete could be crowned, priests lit the sacred fire at the altar of Zeus, its smoke rising into the sky as an invitation to the divine. In that moment, the world of mortals paused, ritual replacing rivalry and piety overshadowing politics. And from this sacred space, the Olympic Games emerged, not as sport, but as a holy dialogue between humans and gods, a dialogue that would soon unite all of Greece. During his service, he heard whispers from the northern frontier, news of Rome tightening its grip on Germania, tribes being humiliated by corrupt governors, and lands being carved into provinces before anyone asked the locals. Rome didn't see the tribes as allies. It saw them as unclaimed property. Taxation, forced disarmament, and puppet chieftains followed. To Augustus, Germania was another prize waiting to be absorbed. To Arminius, it was still home. And so the double life began. By day, he rode with Roman officers, smiling, feigning loyalty. By night, he weighed everything Rome had taught him, not as lessons to serve the empire, but as tools to break it. The irony was almost poetic. Rome's training had not Romanized Arminius. It had weaponized him. He was now a soldier who understood both worlds, the discipline of Rome and the fury of Germania. And soon, Rome would learn that this was the deadliest combination imaginable.